Can you give it a try?
It looks good. Thank you. All right. Tell me, how does that look on your end?
Looks great. We're all set.
Fabulous. Well, so this is the beneficial use of water for posterity. My name is Christopher Hall, Executive Director of Water League, and we're here based out of Oregon and across the West, all the way west of the 100th meridian. In fact, much of the water policies are very similar, although each state does have its own little unique style to it. To the World Water Week in 2025 has a theme: water, states, and transformations. And so today, we're going to follow along with that theme. We'll explore the role of water within the institutional frameworks that govern its access, use, and distribution. This conversation that we'll be having is about how agencies and organizations, and I'll mention my experiences mostly with Oregon, but again, a lot of this applies to the West, and where it doesn't apply to Oregon or rather Texas, I'll let you know. But it will discuss how these agencies and organizations address water-based inequities, inequalities, and conservation. And that includes problems that are inherent with the conventional wisdom, which is like how agencies and organizations have been thinking about water for many years. Then we'll move from those problems onto transformative solutions to the environmental and social political challenges that water scarcity and governance are both posing as concerns and then also seeing as opportunities. When we talk about the beneficial use of water for posterity, we are talking about a case for a new and a robust implementation of the beneficial use of water to ensure that the public interest is protected now and in the future. And by that, we mean the literal use of water to secure our future and resolve conflicts with our future selves. I want to note that all views and opinions expressed here are representative of Water League only. So let's see here. There we go. Water League. Well, we have a trident that is an element of our logo, and our mission is to engage the public in water stewardship. And briefly, the reason why is because, at least insofar as the state of Oregon is concerned, less than 1% of the population controls the water governance and management, and also manages to use more than 90% of the water for purposes that are not domestic or living, essentially. And we believe that the water governance and the management needs to be democratized so that the public interest is served above and ahead of special interests. I'd like to start out with a lovely picture. This is Little Grayback Creek, and this is during mid-September. So the water is cool as a result of base flows that are entering the stream channels from groundwater. And throughout much of the West, groundwater is connected hydraulically with surface water. And so this water is not coming from snowmelt. It's not coming from rains of any sort because we're in a Mediterranean climate and the rains haven't come yet. This is strictly coming from groundwater. And this is the lifeblood of our communities and our society. First off, Water League acknowledges and honors all the Indigenous peoples who made their home since time immemorial throughout the areas where Water League works and upon whose ancestral homelands we live. Water League acknowledges the care by which Indigenous inhabitants have stewarded precious natural resources for millennia and seeks to be of service within this historical framework. At Water League, we hold biospheric values, and those values are recognizing that each one of us is the closest to nature we'll ever get, our own bodies. And that is true for the fact that our bodies are the closest to water that we'll ever be. Each one of us is a discrete hydrologic unit and a part of the river. So how we care for water is how we act, and we view ourselves as a valued element or an emanation of nature. We believe that how we treat water is how we treat ourselves and how we treat others, especially since we are water. We invite all to get in league with water, which is getting in league with each other, building community and connections with all creatures, flora, fauna, humans, mountains, rivers, glades, meadows, and aquifers. The topics that are related to the beneficial use of water are, and this is a pretty comprehensive list, though it's only just a few: water use and water quality, equitable access to water, conservation of water for posterity, which means for future generations, the beneficial use preferences and priorities, which means deciding how water ought to be preferred and prioritized as water scarcity becomes worse. Public interest in water use now and in the future, which we hold to be one of the most important criteria, because a lot of times water is used for special interests and it is harming the greater public interest, both in the present moment and for future descendants. Environmental health is public health, and we strongly believe that that's the case. What happens to our environment is going to happen to us because we are part of that world. The public trust doctrine, as some may know, is the 2,000-year-old doctrine started in Rome. Indigenous communities have held the same beliefs and understandings since time immemorial about holding water in trust and doing so for the greater public interest. And then the rights and responsibilities to nature, which is a way to look at water as an end into itself for protection and conservation. A lot of times we think we need to protect the water for human use, but we really need to be protecting the water for its own very well-being. So before we get too far into this, we're going to look at how Oregonians, and this is similar throughout the West, use, extract, and exploit water. And again, I'm going to repeat that: use, extract, and exploit water. So in Oregon, and this is very similar for much of the West, you'll see on this graph here, on the left is where water comes from, and on the right is where it goes out. And on the left, we have surface water and we have groundwater. And 78% of all the water that humans are extracting comes from streams and rivers and creeks. And then only 22% comes from groundwater. Where does the water go after humans extract it? Well, 78% of it is used by irrigation. That's a substantial amount. Public supply, which represents municipal water supplies, those are cities of all sizes, uses 9%. And that includes all the domestic uses, the commercial uses, the industrial uses. When folks are concerned about large server farms, computer server farms using water, that's all part of the public supply, 9%. Aquaculture and hatcheries use about 10%, and a lot of that water is passed through and not consumptive. And then domestic self-supply. In the state of Oregon, we have 225,000 home domestic wells, and they only use 1% of the water. And then the other 2% are some other minor uses. This other graph here is going to look at just groundwater. And the reason why we're interested in some of this information is because it's going to become relevant further on in the talk. The groundwater use, as you can see here, is broken up into domestic uses, which we talked about earlier, irrigation, and community. And we're just going to look at the first three. Community refers to those municipal supplies. Irrigation refers to irrigation, and domestic refers to domestic wells. And we'll see the blue is the percentage of all the wells, and the red is the amount or the volume of water pumping. And so we'll see with domestic wells are 88% of all the wells in the state, but they only use 4% of the groundwater. And remember that groundwater was just 22% of all the water used totally. When we look at irrigation, they comprise only 7% of all the wells, but they use 82% of all the groundwater. And then with municipalities like public water supplies, well, they represent 1% of the wells and 10% of the water. And what I'll also note is that insofar as Oregon is concerned, a little over 80% of the 4.2 million members of the population use water from communities. They are public supply water folks. We'll now review a few aspects of the conventional wisdom that guides water management and governance before discussing why we would consider the beneficial use of water for posterity. And the conventional wisdom, I'll point out, is the conceptual ideology, the hegemony, the ideas that have been around for a long time about how things are done. And a lot of times people refer to that as political inertia. And what we argue is that those ideas got us to where we are today, that is causing so many problems. When modern humans occupy territory, we fabricate and we expand built environments. So the room that I'm in, the room that you're in, the city, the big agricultural crop circles, the irrigation pivots, anything that you can think of that we build, those are the built environments. And we do that by degrading the natural resources commonly understood as the natural environment. We basically take the natural environment and we break it down into pieces and make the built environment. Every aspect of this activity includes water use. When referencing water diversions going from the natural environment to the built environment, there is this term that experts use, and they call it export. And what they do is they refer to water exports from the ecosystem, the natural environment, and they move it into the built environments. And so I'm just going to break this down here for a second. This is a quote from the Public Policy Institute of California titled Managing California's Freshwater Ecosystems from 2017. And this is an example of the language and the ideology when they talk about taking the natural environment and bringing it into the built environment. The volume of system and ecosystem water does not translate directly to a loss of water for exports. In wetter years, there is often sufficient water to meet water quality and flow requirements without reducing exports. To make up for export pumping restrictions in some month, exporters can often vary the timing of pumping. It goes on, and throughout this report, there is the discussion about how water is exported out of the natural environment and imported into the built environment. When we extract water from the land, we drain its life force. All of those exports have a negative side effect. We believe and we know that all water animates life. And so when we extract water from land and we drain its life force, we are putting a great deal of stress and pressure on living creatures, both flora, fauna, and then humans to come. Too many policies that we create ignore this obvious fact and extract the value of that life in a short-sighted, short-term effort of temporary gain. And that is one of the key elements of the conventional wisdom. All water use policy is about managing the process of separating water from land. If you think of water and land, it is one entity. We must be more careful about how we separate water from land because the two substances form one entity. Here's an example from Oregon about how we commodify and monetize water and turn it into and equate it with money. And what happens is that when we do so, we end up setting up the system for mining water. There is a title for a bill. It's called Purposes and Policies to be considered in formulating a state water resources program. And the text of that bill says, that law says, that it is in the public interest that integration and coordination of uses of water and augmentation of existing supplies for all beneficial purposes be achieved for the maximum economic development thereof, for the benefit of the state as a whole. When we equate water with money, we will almost stop at nothing to extract it. And so when we talk about separating water from land, we are going to do that through mining techniques without any stop because of the need and the drive for wealth and financial aggrandizement in our culture. And again, this is a general policy across the West, which is that water use must be for the highest economic development. The conventional wisdom literally says water equals money. And for instance, alfalfa unlocks about 1/9 of 1 cent per gallon in Eastern Oregon. We can estimate how much financial value is in the aquifers in the streams, which is really quite extraordinary. And by using science, we can measure the rate of flow in aquifers, which is called the transmissivity, and we can measure how big they are and how much water they store, which is called the storage coefficient. We can measure the annual recharge and discharge within the basins, and we can estimate how many years are left, which equals how much more money is left in the ground to mine if we're pumping groundwater. And we can also determine how much value is in the stream each year before we dewater it every summer. So if water equals money, then is it just like gold? Is it just like oil? Because we value water as an economic resource to extract and mine for financial value, it appears as if we will stop at nothing to extract water. And this is a good point in the conversation to say, well, now who is we? We are people like me. I am a settler who came from, in this case, I came from the East Coast, but a lot of people who came here from Europe over the last several hundred years have managed to mine not just water, but gold and oil and other products. And I am not referring to the indigenous population when I use the term we. This is a good friend of mine. He is standing in Deer Creek, which is a major tributary to the Illinois River. And this river should be flowing through base flows like that picture I showed you at the very beginning of this presentation. This is the summer of 2021. And the reason why this river is dried and like a gravel road is because water users overpumped the streams and the tributaries to this river, and they overpumped the groundwater. And this was the year in 2021 when organized crime syndicates sacked the Illinois Valley, which is in Southwest Oregon, and quintupled the amount of acreage that was used to unlawfully grow cannabis. This is a devastation. Another beautiful picture, compliments of Google Earth. This is Eastern Oregon. It's a work of modern art insofar as I'm concerned. And the earth is heavily alkaline out there, but it's ever made worse. The soil salinization has become poisonous, and the crop circles are 160 acres. You'll see the portions of them in the bottom left corner. And they are growing alfalfa in a desert. They're pumping water that was put in the ground 5,000 to 35,000 years ago. The USGS calls that ancient water. It will take generations for these aquifers to recover, if at all. And they are pumping like it's 1949. And the state of Oregon is finally moving to restrict pumping to prevent the wholesale destruction of the groundwater reservoirs. This is what water mining looks like. Now, if water equals life, as I have learned and many have learned from indigenous communities, well, then it appears we may be extracting ourselves because we are the closest to water we'll ever get. Worse, we are foreclosing on the future and we are extracting the lives of those who are yet to come. We argue that the public of the future is at risk. The environmental health of the ecosystem we all rely upon for survival is at risk. And we argue that we are in conflict with our future selves. We are fighting the future with its hands tied behind its back. It's not here to put up a fight. Our descendants are the quintessential silent majority with no voice. And we ask, are we in a resource war with the future? Is that what's really going on? The conventional wisdom, as we mentioned earlier, dictates that officials focus on legislating economic benefits for the short-term present, which blurs the harms threatening the future. Today, we know and must do better. And so therefore, we present the beneficial use of water for posterity. This is the solution, as I mentioned earlier, to the conventional wisdom and the ideology that has aligned water with money and has incentivized mining water. Again, posterity is a fancy term for future generations. We believe in using water for future generations. Now, in the 19th century, the 1800s, water use only had to be beneficial to the users. So if somebody showed up and wanted to pump a stream, the expectation was that they could do so if it was a benefit to them. But then in the 20th century, water also had to be in the greater public interest, or at least it could not harm the public health, safety, and welfare. And the reason why this was developing is because there was a lot of infrastructure and a lot of industrialization, and the water use all of a sudden had a much bigger impact on the society and on the economy. But now, as we enter the 21st century, we argue that water use must be in the interest of the future public, in posterity. So it's not good enough just for the water user to pump the stream dry and benefit from it, or that it might only benefit or at least not harm the present members of the public. We argue that it cannot harm the future. We argue that we must only use water when it's beneficial to the greater public of the present and the future. And at the very least, water cannot harm the public health, safety, and ecosystem now and later. How was water use harm institutionalized into our society or into our system of laws? How is it done? We have done the research, and it started with the doctrine of discovery, manifest destiny, and by clearing away all who stood in the way of expansion by settlers who were told to go west and take whatever it is you find, and hence the term the Wild West. And I'll just stop for a moment and mention that doctrine of discovery is a formal doctrine of the United States government. It was handed over, I believe, from Rome and from Europe. And what it meant was, if you're walking around and you find a $20 bill, you can pick it up and it's yours because you found it. And that concept is what drove the westward expansion and is what gave the settlers and the miners and the military the governmental right to just take land and claim it for themselves, as if it wasn't already being used by indigenous people. The 19th century doctrine, prior appropriation, came from miners who took land, water, and minerals under the doctrine of discovery, which is, as I mentioned, a formal doctrine of the US government. Now, some folks may not know what prior appropriation means. It's a doctrine of water use. It's also recognized and called seniority, and it draws inspiration from the doctrine of discovery and the reign of monarchy lineages and firstborn winner takes all type of ideology. Prior appropriation is that if you got to the river first or you got to the spigot first, then you have the best claim to that water. And anybody else who comes after you has a second, third, fourth, and so on claim. So you have the prior appropriation and you have seniority. And that is the metric by which the laws determine whether or not the water can or cannot flow. And that is whether whoever got to the spigot or the water first gets to use it. Seniority pertains only to the very few people who hold water rights on streams and aquifers during summer and fall months when they compete for who's going to dewater that stream or drain the aquifer. Seniority is silent on the use impacts to society and the ecosystem. So the water use, they drain the water from a stream for whatever purposes, and it may benefit them. And seniority is silent on how it negatively impacts the rest of society or the ecosystem. Seniority only speaks to whoever got in line first. And this is a major element of the conventional wisdom. There is another doctrine, and it does oversee the value of water as it relates to society and the environment. This is not necessarily a competing doctrine, but it has paralleled prior appropriation ever since the start. The doctrine of the beneficial use of water, and this is a compact between water users and the rest of the public, and it's vastly larger in scope than the doctrine of prior appropriation. As we mentioned, prior appropriation is just between the two water users up on a hill scuffling or having a bar fight over who's going to get to dewater that stream. And the result is whoever got there first gets to use the water and the other person has to get regulated off. The beneficial use of water is before all of that. And what the beneficial use of water does is it says your water use must be either in the public interest or at least it can't harm the public health, safety, and welfare. And once we've determined that this is the case, then you can argue about who gets to use the water on that stream. All water use must be beneficial, not just to the user, but to all of society. And again, we restate this because it's one of the most important points. At the very least, water use cannot be a detriment to the public health, safety, and welfare, and to the ecosystem. Again, and I reiterate, prior appropriation is only an agreement among the very few water users, and it typically applies only for a few hot summer and fall months. Seniority is tiny in scope, since the field is limited by the small number of parties and the times and locations when seniority matters. Large water users, and if you remember now, those graphs at the beginning of this conversation showed that irrigation uses 78% of all the water in Oregon, and it's very similar across many of the states in the West. Large water users have lobbied our elected and appointed officials for decades by pressing the idea that if water right has seniority to remain pumping, then virtually nothing can stop the water extraction. And this, we argue, is pure political fiction. There is no justification for arguing that a water right may authorize water use under all circumstances and without any regard for any negative impacts, so long as it has seniority, so long as it is sufficiently old enough or senior enough to be in place where others could be regulated. And so there may be, out of 100 water users on a stream, 50 of them get regulated off as juniors because the stream flow is too low, and there's only enough for the other half, the top 50, the oldest, most senior 50. But then as the months go by, there's probably 1 or 2 water right holders left standing, and they are the most senior water right holders. And we argue that the impunity that allows them to pump without any other consideration except for the fact that they're the most senior water right holders is a fictional idea that was invented, and it does not and cannot stand any longer. Water users and their patrons have strategically ignored the beneficial use of water doctrine and the question of whether their water use is in the public interest of the present and the future. We argue that such ignorance can no longer be tolerated in the 21st century. States in the West have chosen to apply the beneficial use of water doctrine only once in the life of a water right, at the time when the water user first proves use. And so what this means is that if a water right was perfected in 1910, say in the state of Oregon, then over a century has gone by before anybody has ever gone back to check and see whether that water right is still authorizing beneficial water uses. The idea that you can get a water right, you can put it to use, which is, oh, maybe irrigating something, who knows, and then never look back ever again is a choice. It is a political choice, and it is as arbitrary and capable of being changed as any other political choice. We ask, why have officials ignored the ongoing implementation of the beneficial use doctrine? And it's quite simple. Under water right audits or reviews, which is what we recommend, which is auditing and reviewing these water rights, too much irrigation water use could be shown to cause more harm than good to the public health, safety, and welfare. And were this harm documented, corrective actions could not be avoided. So it's the old system of don't look, because if you do, we'll have to do something. On this matter, there is one very obvious example that Oregon could not ignore. So we're going to go and take a look at an example of what is a beneficial use of water and what is, and it's beneficial to the user, but it's not beneficial to the public. And we're going to look at this as an example. It's the following example is useful for how Oregon has taken action once the facts became known and they had to look. And the question is, what water use benefited the users but not the public? Well, this is a good one. This cartoon, oh no, it's Oregon's illegal marijuana cartel. Here, what do you want? Wallet, purse, keys? We want your water. And these are organized crime syndicates who more or less drained large portions of Southwest Oregon in 2021. Organized crime syndicates sacked Southwest Oregon in that year and increased the irrigated acreage by 450% in Josephine County, which led to horrendous negative impacts. Their water use may have been beneficial to the users, but it wasn't beneficial to the greater public. In fact, the water use harmed the public and the ecosystem health. There were human rights violations, depleted groundwater, there were dry stream beds, polluted water, there were mowed down riparian areas, there was mayhem on our rural highways, stressed out and killed wildlife, rampant code violations, and our communities were living under the existential threat of organized crime syndicates. In his book on liberty, John Stuart Mill said, quote, that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. Water uses that harm others are not in the public interest and cannot be allowed to persist. I want to repeat one more time that the only purpose for which we can use power to stop somebody from certain behaviors is when those behaviors harm others. And we argue that too much water use harms the public health, safety, and welfare and the ecosystems. We pressed the case that water use by organized crime syndicates was not in the public interest by citing the beneficial use of water doctrine. As a result, and we were quite pleased with these results, Oregon responded and it passed HB 4061 in 2022 that prohibited the delivery of municipal bulk water to sites with unlicensed cannabis present. And it also passed Senate Bill 326 in 2023 that outlawed using a water right to irrigate unlicensed cannabis. What I'll mention is that in the state of Oregon, and it's similar to many other states, but not all of them, you cannot use water and irrigate with it if you're going to be selling commercial products. And the state of Oregon at first was telling us that an organized crime syndicate with a 100-acre illegal grow could nurture that crop with water so long as they had a water right. And when we pointed out to them just how wrong that was, they backed away and they passed a law that said you cannot use water from a water right to irrigate unlicensed cannabis. And in fact, it's unlawful to irrigate licensed or unlicensed cannabis or tomatoes for that matter, unless you have a water right. And again, with HB 4061, the first bill, imagine bulk water trucking from a city, and the city is cashing in on the green rush, and it's selling water to the truck drivers who are delivering these big trucks to water to these unlicensed sites, and the state outlawed that as well. And the reason why is because they were not beneficial uses of water. The assertion of beneficial use related to cannabis is only a foot in the door. And the reason why is because we hold that a plant does not have to be heavily regulated for its irrigation to harm the public health and ecosystems. We'll repeat that. Cannabis was just a foot in the door. We are not prudes. In fact, I have myself grown cannabis under the medical marijuana provisions within the state of Oregon years ago. And that has never posed an existential threat the way, the organized crime syndicates did. What we will say is that cannabis is a foot in the door to other uses. And again, we hold that a plant does not have to be heavily regulated for its irrigation to harm the public health and ecosystems. For instance, too many groundwater dependent ecosystems, Environmental Species Act species, domestic wells, and forests are harmed by some water uses. Cities, which serve 80% of populations in Oregon, they don't know where their long-term water sources will come from because too many animal forage crops have seniority. There are cities such as Bend in Oregon, and it's in Eastern Oregon, and it's a big city relative for, Oregon, and it's surrounded by fields that are growing all sorts of forage crops. And the city of Bend is stressed out about where its water is going to come from 25, 50, and 75 years from now, because it has junior water rights to alfalfa. We think that they're going to have to buy those water rights out, but that is just one solution. In Oregon, which is similar to the other Western states, and we mentioned this earlier in those graphs that you saw, 78% of all water diversions go to large-scale irrigation. 9% goes to the cities, 1% goes to the domestic wells, and again, 10% goes to aquaculture and hatcheries, which are mostly non-consumptive. We argue, given the fact that 9% of the water use is consumed by cities, that we will never wring enough water from cities to conserve our way into prosperous posterity. We just can't go to the cities and say, look, don't offer a glass of water at the restaurants because it's using too much water, or, if they want water, they're going to have to ask for it. That is never going to solve the water problem. Changing your shower head is never going to solve the water problem. And that is because 78%, which is almost 9 times as much water, 78% goes to large diversions for irrigation. And at least in the state of Oregon, 55% of that are animal forage crops that we don't even eat. When a perennial stream is dewatered every summer and fall, then that is the same as a permanent effect far below what's called natural variability. When an aquifer is drained below the root zones of trees, they die. When the water levels keep dropping, domestic wells fail. All along, groundwater-dependent ecosystems suffer. Now, we've been in the West, and it's not across all of the West, but it's big portions of it. We've been in a 1 in 1,200 year mega drought, and we experience widespread over-appropriation of water. So we're in a drought, and we're pumping too much, and those are leading to increasing aridification of the West and declining aquifers and streams. Probably the worst time to be over pumping our aquifers and streams is when we're in a drought. The volume of water on Earth, as we all know, is constant. However, its location and its quality can change. Well, so that's fine so long as you have fresh water that you need to live, but that isn't the case for everybody. And in fact, water scarcity is the result of scaring off water like a deer. That's how we put it. There's still deer around, but they're not in your backyard. And so I'm going to mention a little difference here between what's the difference between natural variability and water scarcity. Natural variability are things that we really don't have a lot of control over, such as drought. There's the ice age, there's the interglacial periods, there are the 4 seasons. Natural variability is something that humans in general don't necessarily control, whereas water scarcity is the result of policies that we can control. And in fact, scarcity refers to, in general, when we think of economic terms, and we're applying that term here, refers to limited resources in the face of unlimited human needs and the political choices on how to allocate those scarce resources. So scarcity is very much like income inequality when we talk about water scarcity. And with regard to natural variability, we also want to point out that humans most certainly have had an impact on the climate through anthropogenic climate change. And yet we don't even control how that is playing out. So while the built environment can wreak havoc on the natural environment in the form of anthropogenic climate change and the acidification of the oceans, and a number of other climatic effects, we may impact that, but we actually don't control how it falls out, how it plays out. We argue that never in human history have so many people attempted to pump water towards them. Let me restate that. Never in human history have so many people pumped so much water away from themselves in an ironic effort to pump water towards themselves. For the last 100 and some years, we have been applying all sorts of technology to pump water towards ourselves, whether it's using electrical pump or flumes or dams or any other types of infrastructure. And the more and more we try to artificially bring water to ourselves, the further we're driving it away. It is a terrible irony. Annual groundwater recharge has been declining in regions across the West due to this pumping, due to this desire to bring water towards ourselves. And it's especially happening in areas west of the 100th meridian. In fact, actually, the groundwater recharge has been harmed by hotter winters and drier winters, and winters as a result of climate change. And then with the pumping, these aquifers are not recovering. And the groundwater recharge is increasing worse and worse every year. And in fact, there's been a stair-stepping down of groundwater levels, and it has occurred in some places faster than others. But what happens is that each year it drops a little bit and doesn't come back up in the winter. It drops a little bit more and doesn't come back up in the winter. And the reason why it's dropping is because we're pumping as much and hard as possible. And the result with perennial streams is that they're declining, and the base flows that will come and fill those streams up during the summer and the fall are also receding. The only way to evaporate deep groundwater within aquifers and confined groundwater reservoirs is with a pump. Climate change cannot reach down into an aquifer. Furthermore, tree roots don't go anywhere near as deep as our domestic wells, which are 40 feet to 200 feet deep, or the depths of irrigation wells, which can be 500 to 1,000 feet. Tree roots, they just don't reach that far down. And so they're not responsible for draining these aquifers. Irrigated crops, such as alfalfa, they have artificial roots that are as deep as the wells. And so if we're irrigating alfalfa in a desert and there's a well with 1,000-foot hole in the ground, that's effectively how deep the roots are for the alfalfa. So when we're thinking about how is it that the groundwater is declining, it's not a result of climate change, although the pumpers are pumping ever harder to keep up with the vapor pressure deficits and to keep up with the needs that a drier climate is pushing. We can control the overpumping of water. While we can't control necessarily how hot it's going to be during the summer, how little water is going to be coming during the winter, what we can do is we can control the pumping. The beneficial use of water for posterity proposes limits to water use for only the highest and best purposes as scarcity worsens. So as water scarcity is worsening and the natural variability that we have impacted through climate change is causing a drier climate, we have to make some hard choices. And we have to limit water use to the highest and best purposes. And that's what we argue the beneficial use of water for posterity does. Overpumping water is not in the general public interest in the present or the future. And the reason why is because it harms our public health and ecosystems. Overpumping water is the use of water that may benefit the user who gets that water, but it harms the rest of us. And that's where we think, oh, well, it must be overpumped at that point. It's because it's harming us. And we're going to see a couple pictures of what non-beneficial uses of water look like. This is a picture we saw earlier. This is a result of the non-beneficial use of water. This is the result of groundwater being overpumped. We spoke about this earlier. This is Lake Hebert, and it's July, and it's been completely drained. And the reason why Lake Hebert has been drained is because the water that flows from the Shiwakan River is over-appropriated by irrigators, and they completely drained out that river. And so then this lake has basically dried up as a result. This is one of the organized crime syndicates. There were over 1,000 of these grows in a 200 square mile area. That's roughly 8 miles wide by 24 miles. And there were over 1,000 of these grows. They were 82% were unlawful and were illegal. And this is immediately after harvest. This is what it looked like. Not a beneficial use of water. This is one of the labor camps that was illegal, that had narco slaves living in it. These people were victims, and the sheriff, who was raiding these properties with over 100, different police and law enforcement professionals, they were under the opinion, and their view was that they were working on human rights violations. They didn't even care about the cannabis grows. They were there to address the problems the people had. They were there to address the human rights violations. And not a single one of the workers ever got arrested because they were victims. Sheriff was cleaning up the rivers. And this is just one of our reservoirs that should never be this dry during midsummer. And this is in Ashland, Oregon. And here's a couple pictures of what the beneficial use of water does look like. It looks like our friends and family members at farmers markets. And it looks like beautiful fruits and vegetables. And also, it looks like El Paso. This is a picture, compliments of Google Earth, of El Paso. And this is a community. And one of the interesting things about cities is that they're some of the most efficient users of water. Very few places are as efficient with water use as cities. And if we recall, municipal public water supplies, and we're speaking for Oregon here, use 9% of the water that's diverted every year, compared to, say, irrigation, which uses 78%. So when we talk about, oh, look at the city, it's in a desert, well, this is nothing compared to crop circles that are outside the city. Will the folks at the controls of the Great Water Rush govern and manage water for the future as eagerly as they do seeking short-term economic value in the present? And when we talk about the Great Water Rush, we think of the gold rush. There have been references to the green rush with cannabis. Well, we argue that the Great Water Rush is the entire movement of settlers coming out to the West since the mid-19th century. Every element and aspect has used water, and we haven't been careful enough about how we separate water from land. So we ask if they will govern and manage water for the future eagerly as they do, seeking short-term economic value in the present. Changing minds and perspectives and the political culture is inexpensive. What costs a lot of money is perpetuating the errors of the past century. One of the most serious errors of all time is putting the present in seniority over the future. For all intents and purposes, the future is a junior water user, and we are regulating off our descendants. We make the argument that the present has seniority over the future, which is a junior water right user, and we're shutting them off. That is the real extent and truth of the doctrine of prior appropriation. The old saying that whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting presumed a struggle in the present moment. But every fight over water has harmed the future far worse than any bar fight. We are far more in conflict with our future selves, our descendants, and the flora, fauna, and entire ecosystems. Correcting this error requires political will. To resolve our conflict with the future, we must acknowledge that every beneficial use today has an impact on tomorrow. Many of them are negative, and some uses of water are worse than others. We must use water for its highest and best purposes to live today for tomorrow. And that is what we call the beneficial use of water for posterity. And this is a former hemp farm, and it is looking south over the Siskiyou Mountains. And this is what happens when you don't have water and you burned out the land and you use too much. It's actually quite beautiful. And so there we have it. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to make this presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Yeah, a couple of comments, Chris. Here in the desert, the lower Rio Grande, we export water by growing water-intensive crops like pecans that use 600 to 900 gallons to produce a pound of pecans that is sent elsewhere. So we take water from the desert and a lot of it goes to China. We export pecans to China. The same is true of the cotton that we grow here. This was complicated, unlike your cannabis farms and hemp. Those are annual crops. This is complicated by pecan orchards being a capital investment. It costs a lot of money to plant them. And the best years of a pecan tree, I understand, I'm not a farmer, are from 35 to 65 years old. So you can't just fallow an orchard for a year in a bad year. So we're kind of locked in to this feeding the present at the expense of the future. Because of this situation, I'm not quite sure what to do about it. I've suggested that we do a gradual realignment of our agriculture into growing food crops that are consumed locally. Then at least the water would stay here, you know what I mean? I don't know if that's possible or not. But are the crops that you're dealing with annuals or perennials?
So you bring up a very good point, which is what to do when the orchards are a major long-term investment. I will tell you that in the Rogue Basin, which is the basin in which we live, and it's the big southwestern basin in Oregon, we have some of the largest pear farms. And you may have heard of Barry and David, for instance. And in the last 5 or 6 years, we have seen the wholesale destruction of vast swaths of the pear industry. It is the result of not having enough water to keep those trees alive. Pears, you might get a wild pear tree to live in the Rogue Valley, like a plum, that type of thing, and it might be just fine. But when you plant thousands and thousands upon thousands of acres that all need huge amounts of irrigation, they're not going to survive when there's not enough water. And we've seen a lot of pear orchards and vast tracts just be chopped up and bulldozed over. The issue that you're talking about, which is more specific, is that the farmers who made a decision to plant long-term investment orchards, they are at risk because they took a gamble as to whether or not there's going to be water. And the issue is that if you shut off an annual crop like alfalfa, you're not going to be growing that alfalfa in year 2 or year 3 or year 4 or going forward. And it simulates the same effect of just cutting down the pecan trees, basically, whether it's an annual or whether it's a perennial or it's an orchard. If it's off, it's off. And so the argument has been in California, they have dealt with this issue extensively, and they simply say, look, there isn't the water for this area. It doesn't matter what you're growing. And if you put all this money into growing these pears, really it's not the money that they put in, it's the opportunity cost in the future. They're like, well, we got another 20 years on these pecan trees or these pear trees or these whatever, the grapevines. And every one of these orchards were started out with every tree is like a small whip. If you've seen them when they plant them, it's like a small cutting that's planted. It takes 10 to 15 years for the trees to mature and to be productive. The investment that's put into those orchards it's actually not that significant. What's significant is the opportunity cost in the future. And we argue the opportunity cost is the same whether it's an annual plant or it's a perennial. And so Another issue that you brought up, which is fascinating, is the export of the water. There's a term called virtual water export. And so when you're pumping your groundwater or you're pumping your surface water and it's going into a plant and that plant is evapotranspirating and it's growing, and then you go and harvest all that stuff and you ship it out of your state and you ship it out of your nation, with it is going all that water in a very real sense. It's interesting, in Eastern Oregon, the biggest export market that makes the most money goes to like the United Arab Emirates and to Saudi Arabia, although they also ship alfalfa to Japan and China. And the reason why they're shipping this product over there is because it makes a lot of money. You can get more money for your alfalfa than if you just ship it down the road. Even the shipping costs are irrelevant, essentially. And yet that alfalfa is dry as a bone. They dried that alfalfa because they're not going to ship all that wet, rotting alfalfa. They ship dry bales of alfalfa. And yet the amount of water that was used to grow that alfalfa is effectively what's being exported. Now that we have climate change and our recharge is much diminished compared to the artificial discharge from pumping, what's happening is there's a deficit, just like in one basin alone, the Harney Basin, there's 110,000 acre-foot deficit between recharge and discharge. And so we argue that insofar as alfalfa is concerned, there is no less than a very real 110,000 acre volume of water that gets shipped out of that basin every year in the form of alfalfa. And the term that is used is a virtual water export, but when we talk about the deficit, that's a very real water export. So the political issue that I hear you talking about in the desert in Texas, where they're growing pecans, is a political will. The public is probably, if they knew what was going on, the public probably would not support it. They would be like, what? You're like draining our aquifers and draining the Rio Grande so that we can ship pecans to China? That, no, thank you. And that's where the public interest is not in alignment with the special interests of the water user. And what's actually revolutionary is basically saying that the beneficial use isn't sufficient just by checking with the water user. You must now check with the public. And when you do check with the public, they're going to say, yeah, not just me, but my kids, my grandkids, and 7 generations down the line. And we've learned that from our indigenous friends who have shared with us their traditional ecological knowledge on the matter.
Are there any other questions?
Judith, are there any questions at Waterholta?
You're tuned into our
No,
partner
we are
across-
fine. Thank you.
So I have a follow-up, Chris, about this issue about pecans. Could an alternative, well, I don't know if it's a solution, it's more like thinking alternatively, to use the same economic system to change things, right? So one example is coffee. So in Mexico, in the 80s, coffee used to be widely exported because it was expensive, right? So it was very profitable for the coffeeteers in Mexico. But then when South America and Africa started mass producing coffee, then the prices went down instantaneously. And the production of coffee in Mexico almost disappeared, especially in Oaxaca, right? So now those haciendas no longer exist. So could we artificially impose something like that to pecans?
So what I understand you're saying is that the oversupply of the market drove the price so low that it wasn't profitable or even sensible to grow the coffee anymore. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Yeah. So the you bring up an interesting point, because the almond market in California has been brought to its knees by oversupply. In fact, I'll divert here. I'll just step aside here for a second and talk about pork, pigs. There's a thing called the pork cycle in economics. And it's like a sine wave that goes up and down. And because pigs and piglets are fast growing and a sow can have lots of pigs, what'll happen is that maybe the market oversupplies because the price of pork is high. So everybody gets into growing pigs, but then they overflood the market. And then all of a sudden the price of pork drops. And so everybody gets out of pigs. And over the last 100 years in the United States of America, you could almost see a perfect sine wave of like, and I'm not sure like how many months it is up and down, but the people keep coming into the market and leaving the market because of an oversupply and a price drop. And then when the price drops and everybody gets out, now the price goes back up again. And so what's interesting is that with almonds in California, the price went through the roof because China was buying all the almonds. And so everybody got into almonds and they oversupplied the market. And what's interesting is the same thing happened with cannabis in 2021 and 2022. We saw a 450% increase just locally in the cannabis market. And so the price of cannabis went from like $1,000 a pound down to like $100 a pound. And, you know, people just couldn't produce it for that price because it's so labor intensive. And as a result, the market collapsed. And so with pecans, there is a possibility that somebody is going to grow pecans in another part of America, or even internationally for that matter, and will drive the price of pecans down to a point where it's not economically feasible anymore to grow them in the desert outside of El Paso or in Southwest Texas. The pecan market, the almond market, the coffee market, I'm not an expert, but I do understand that these are international markets, and the extent to which people enter these markets in different states across the United States of America, and then in different areas. So if like, I don't know where else coffee was grown, but if there was a lot of coffee grown in different locations, yes, the price collapsed. And there is the possibility that pecans could be the next domino. I was looking to buy pecans about a month ago. I was making a cake with apples and carrots in the cake, and I couldn't find any pecans on the store shelf. And I was like, what? And the only ones they have are candied pecans. And so I bought those. I'm an example of somebody who put demand onto the system. And if I saw pecans grown in El Paso, Texas desert, frankly, if I saw that, especially after speaking with you now, I'd be like, I wonder if I should like buy these pecans or not, because I might want them, but is it the right thing to do to put pressure on the system and put pressure on the Rio Grande? One of the things that I have done is substantially reduced the amount of meat that I eat, mainly limiting it to the weekends. And that's simply because, wow, you know, I mean, I'm putting a lot of pressure on the system to grow alfalfa. So I think the concern that the haciendas and the towns had is that, you know, families went out of business, as I understand from what you were saying, as a result of the oversupply. And that's a real tragedy, because I drink coffee. I know that I am responsible for coffee exports from different regions around the world. And I have a lot of thinking to do about that. But at the same time, you know, communities need to survive. And so this is a really delicate balance and a really delicate question that you bring up.
Yeah, and of course we cannot stop eating or drinking stuff, right? But it's a conversation to have on how all of these products can be made more sustainably, and to properly find the locations that can sustain the growth of that production, right?
Yes. Thank you for that. Having the conversations is so valuable. And we maybe aren't in this generation going to solve the problems, but when our grandchildren look to us and they say, well, did you at least talk about it? We can say, yeah, we talked about it. We We set this table, we tried to begin making changes. And that's what I'm doing is I want to be accountable to my children and to my grandchildren and to your children and to your grandchildren and to other people I don't even know, and say, when I was here and when I was alive, I did what I could. And I fought hard, and I didn't want to cause any harm. I didn't want to take a bad situation and make it worse. What I wanted to do was to find solutions that would work for people who are alive today, but more importantly, work for people who are alive tomorrow.
Chris, thank you so much. Thank you for coming back after last year. And I hope you'll be here with us at Water Week, World Water Week next year. It's a big event here. We've gone from what, 16 presenters 2 years ago to 70 presenters this year. We'll probably have over 1,000 participants. This is a very successful event, and you've helped make it that way. So I hope you'll consider coming back next year.
The pleasure is all mine. I am so grateful for the opportunity to be part of your community. And this is a priority for me, and it's a real pleasure. Thank you dearly. And I do look forward to being part of it.
All right. As we say here, adios, amigo. So, okay.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.